Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Hey guys, guess what? I'm back again. Home, bored. I did my food shopping today. I'm trying to only go once a month, though I usually run out of food somewhere at the 3-week mark. And this time I did run out at the 3-week mark, and then I continued to eat whatever was left in the back of the freezer for about another 5 days. So I did some big food shopping today. I filled my cart. It was spilling over with stuff when I left the store. But I got that out of the way. I don't mind it as much. I hate putting the stuff away, though. It takes like 2 hours to put all the stuff away and find space for it. So, having done that project today, and actually involved me leaving the house, here it is, back late in the evening. This is more of the time that I normally do my videos. And, I just did a video yesterday, so I don't know what to do with this one. Do I just put it up when it's done and ready? Do I delay it to give people a little bit of a break? I don't know. Would people rather have them spaced out at intervals, or just throw them up whenever I do them and people can come and discover them whenever? I don't know what the option is there. Of course, it's all up to people's schedules too. I could be putting up things every day, and if people have the time, that's great. Anyway, I'm just going to do some random vinyl pulls because once again I haven't really done any preparation. Before my last video, I did throw a bunch of new vinyl in the back there, though. Getting a glimpse at the handful of things that I bought, which was about thick, about that many vinyls. So I don't know, what was that, like maybe 8-10 albums or so, just to fill out the stuff that I've pulled off. By the way, the stuff I pulled off is on the top shelf there. I can't do this finger thing. That top shelf there is the second shelf, is the stuff that I've already pulled. And the bottom shelf, of course, is where all the magic comes from. So I'm just going to randomly grab something here. That one looks good. Okay, well, it's not an ECM, but you're probably tired of hearing me talk about Wes Montgomery. Back from the vinyl days, back in the early days when I was discovering Wes. Another wonderful twofer. This is really, early in my discovery of mainstream jazz. I kind of first discovered ECM and branched out from there. And, getting into the older, more established artists. In this case, actually, most of the artists that I love have actually passed away, but, in the mainstream jazz world, and even in, other jazz areas, guys like Judd Abercrombie, though that's fairly recent. But back in the mainstream jazz days, when I was discovering guys like Barney Kessel and Herb Ellis and Charlie Byrd, people like that, all these guys were still alive, and they've all passed on now. Wes Montgomery was one of the few guys that passed away. He passed away in 1968, so he passed away before I got into him. The great thing about the 1970s or so, getting into jazz, especially in the late 1970s, was that the record companies were figuring out what to do with all these, well-known, well-established jazz artists, but these albums had been in print for 20, 30 years or so, and they started putting out these wonderful twofer sets. Gave you, some of them were compilations, but most of the time they were pairings of two individual albums that had come out. And they just paired them together, and it was a lot cheaper than buying the individual albums. Usually it was just, it seemed to be about $1 more than a full-priced, regular full album. So at the time, like if an album by a new artist was like $7.98, you would generally be able to get a twofer for like $8.98, you know, an older recording. The good things with the twofers, even better than the original issues of the albums, I find, is of course when the original albums came out, they didn't know whether this would be a historic, important session or not. And I love the original art that came with a lot of the original albums, which is why I ended up buying some of those later. But the great thing about the twofers was because the albums were being reissued and re-released, you know, 20, 30, 40 years after the fact, there was plenty of room for the history of what happened to this collection of musicians, or was this a working band or a one-time thing? How does this fall in the overall career of the artist? And in the case of Wes Montgomery, now here's one of the later twofers. This came out in 1980, and it was not the first time I'd heard his organ trio music, because I did have a reissue of a single album, one of Wes Montgomery's very first albums. I think it was recorded in '59. That was an organ trio, but this is probably my second jumping in to the organ trio. And in this case, this is a little bit of a mishmash, but you know, this is one of my favorite twofers. As you can see, the liner notes are copious. There's a lot of information in here, and this is more of a, instead of just throwing two albums together, this is more of a theme thing. And that is Wes Montgomery's organ trios. Now, Wes Montgomery pretty much, throughout the history of his organ trio recordings, he did record later on with Jimmy Smith, but in his own organ trio group, he had an organ player named Melvin Rhyne that he used throughout the years, on and off, in an organ trio. And the drummer would be an ever-changing position. So you have, on all the selections taken from the various sessions that make up this two-album set, you have Melvin Rhyne on organ, but there's three different drummers depending on what session it is. A guy named Paul Parker, a guy named George Brown, and the great Jimmy Cobb, who's still around, and who played with Miles Davis. So, these are recordings. This is pretty much a very rare instance of a compilation album. There's a number of different sessions. Sessions from October 1959, which happened to be when I was born. April 1963. There's several different April sessions here. And October 1963. And November 1963. So I don't think there's any full. This is very unusual for a twofer. On Milestone Records, by the way, who are very big on the twofers. And this is very rare because I don't think that in here is even one standard full album. This is basically a rare compilation of just all organ trio music spreading over a period of 4 years. And the thing with this one is, instead of just selecting various, let me see how many different albums this is from. Some tracks are from the Wes Montgomery Trio. Some tracks are from an album called Boss Guitar. Some tracks are from an album called Portrait of Wes. And then the side 4 on this album, which is an unusual thing, consists of 4 tracks. 2 different versions of Bobby Timmons' Moanin', and 2 different versions of the Wes Montgomery original, just called Blues Riff. And all 4 of these were previously unreleased. So there are alternate versions that made it onto the original finished studio albums. And so but what they included here are different previously unreleased takes And I don't know whether, I'm guessing these all did come out eventually on CD, but I'm not 100% sure of that. I know there was an album on CD called The Alternate Wes Montgomery, and it was all alternate versions of tracks that hadn't been included on the original albums. So this is 3 sides taking from 3 different albums, and a 4th side of previously unreleased versions of tracks that were new at the time that they came out. So it was a real interesting. I really like this because I like the organ trio. You could say it's somewhat of a limited sound, but maybe you have to be in the mood for it. But the organ and electric guitar, I thought, were 2 instruments that always went well together. I remember really liking this album. And this was not reissued on CD as such, but it's just a compilation. I'm sure all of the full albums that these came from have been released on CD individually. But this was a nice way. This was one I can remember. This made probably like a nice 90-minute cassette to play in your car. Mellow at times, but up-tempo enough to drive around with. And this pretty much used to be my go-to when I was in the mood for organ trio. In the mainstream jazz mode, guitar organ trio. This used to be my go-to album, called Yesterdays by Wes Montgomery. Nice compilation. Very rare for a twofer to be a compilation like that. Pull something else out. What do you know? I pulled out an ECM album. Here is the Gary Burton Quintet, Dreams So Real, the music of Carla Bley, all Carla Bley tracks. I've always loved that cover. Maybe not the most typical ECM, well, I guess it is ECM-ish, kind of the blurry trees there. I like that. Here's recorded December 1975. Very famous for having Pat Metheny, and this is where Pat Metheny came from. When Manfred Eicher, the producer, owner, guy who started ECM Records, heard of Pat Metheny playing in Gary Burton's band, he offered him a solo contract, and the rest is history. So this is 75, and this is the same year that I believe Pat Metheny put out his first solo album in 75, or at least it was recorded in 75. So this is bucking up right about that same time. There's a second guitarist on here, Mick Goodrick, who was for years a teacher in Boston, probably where Gary Burton knew him from. I don't know if he teaches anymore, but very much the senior of Pat Metheny, and he may have even been one of Pat Metheny's teachers, if I'm recalling correctly, when Pat Metheny was in school. It's the 2 guitarists on here. Steve Swallow on bass. Steve Swallow is always on bass on these Gary Burton recordings. There's one recording where he has Abe Laboriel on bass, which always strikes me off guard because Steve Swallow was the guy on bass for all of these Gary Burton albums for the period. And it's funny that I tend to forget that. And then I was like, what, Abe Laboriel? Where's Steve Swallow? So I couldn't figure out why Steve Swallow didn't play on that one album of Gary Burton's from about 70. The New Quartet was 73, 74, must be somewhere around there. And then Bob Moses on drums, who played a bit. He played on a couple albums of Gary Burton's, and also played on. I believe he was a drummer for the first Pat Metheny Group album, which was a trio, just a trio album. So it's a 5-piece band, 2 guitars, bass, drums. And I think I recorded December 75. All the tunes are from Carla Bley. I think it's one of his better group albums. Gary Burton's got a lot of great group albums from this period. This is one of them. I guess because the material is so good, and the band is good too. And it's a bit unusual with 2 guitars. And this is in that same period where he did Passengers and Ring. I like this better than Ring, but I think I prefer Passengers. But this is a bit more, you notice this is a bit more composed. Carla Bley's tunes are a bit more composed than your average jazz kind of cover that people would do, where there's a theme and then you just improvise over the theme. Carla Bley's things seem to have more, the themes run longer, and maybe there's less room for improvisation. And a lot of them are just more thoroughly composed pieces. And, you know, depending on whether or not that's what you want to hear. In this case, the themes are so damn good. And I like it. This is definitely one of the better, I think, Gary Burton albums for me. Dreams So Real. Of course, I'm sure I have this on CD. There's a couple that I've missed so far, but I'm pretty sure I have this on CD. Okay, I'm gonna go over here. Wow, I didn't even know this was back there. Well, here's a change of pace. It's not an ECM record, and it's not a Klaus Schultze album. It's a classic. It's the classic jazz album. Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. How many versions of this do I have? Well, this is the first one. I think this is the first one. Bought it at Discomat, which was a great store, a great chain here that was just in the New York, New Jersey area. $4.99, and as you can see, the nice price sticker. And this was pretty much, just the blank original version of the album that came out. You know, this wasn't even an updated cover or anything. There's you can tell by the font alone and just the design, and the really kind of crappy picture quality. It's a very grainy, dark photo of Miles on the back. But I believe that this is the old Columbia logo on there. Yeah, I believe this is exactly as it came out initially. There's some liner notes on there, but the liner notes are the original liner notes. And it doesn't mention the date. Now, when was this recorded? I want to say 1959, if memory serves. Oh yeah, I stuck a little note in here. Recorded March and April 1959. Considered to be the best-selling mainstream jazz album of all time. How many versions of this do I have? This was my first. I don't think I have another vinyl version. I bought, when I switched to CDs, I bought the first CD version. I bought a second CD version because it was supposedly remastered. And then a third CD version that I have because they remastered it again and made corrections to it and included additional material, which I think were like alternate takes. But it's kind of like the cream of the crop. It's a jazz album that for a lot of years, people that weren't into jazz might have this in their collection, you know. If you had somebody that was fairly hip in the, say in the early 60s, that had a small record collection of, you know, pop music and folk music and, you know, a couple classical albums and a couple jazz albums, this probably would be the jazz album they would have. And maybe a few years later, maybe like Dave Brubeck's Take 5 kind of thing. What can you say about that? You know, 5 tracks, So What, and flamenco sketches and all blues, which were recorded numerous times. Freddie Freeloader, Blue and Green. Wynton Kelly plays piano on one track, and this is Bill Evans on piano. This is famous for bringing Bill Evans, the only white guy in the band. And Bill Evans, I've been listening to a lot of old audio interviews with Bill Evans, and his whole time frame in the Miles Davis group is only about 9 months. And also Jimmy Cobb's on drums on the album, Paul Chambers on bass, John Coltrane on saxophone, and Cannonball Adderley on saxophone. So it's a hell of a band. But I guess Wynton Kelly came after Bill Evans. I always thought it was the other way around. I thought you went from Red Garland to Wynton Kelly to Bill Evans. But maybe it's the other. Maybe when Kelly came and went more than once. I'm not sure. Excellent piano player, by the way. But this was a different kind of concept of jazz, and Miles thought that, with the exception of one track, I guess, which is closer to a blues thing, kind of thought that Bill Evans was more suited for the music, which was original music in this case, not standards anymore. And so he used Bill Evans. But it was tough going for Bill Evans. I just heard an interview. It's strange. This last week or two, I've been listening to old audio interviews with Bill Evans, and it wasn't easy. The audiences in particular were giving him a hard time for being a white guy in a black group, and not so accepting of him. So it was very difficult for him, a difficult time for him. Even though creatively, it was obviously quite a fertile time. And the album runs almost 45 minutes, which is kind of long for an album from this time period. But it's excellent. I have, like I said, I have at least 4 versions of this that I know of, and I may have more. I think the last one is the last one I'll buy, but then you never know what they're going to come out with. Actually, if I know who's going to pull this, I just thought about it. I think I have 5, because they came out with a big box set. I wasn't going to buy it, but somehow I got suckered into it, and it's a full LP size box set, because I think there's another LP version in there which I've never opened and played. I bought it for the CD version, which had extra outtakes in it. I wouldn't have bought it just for a collector's thing, and I certainly wouldn't have bought it to have another vinyl copy. But there's a vinyl copy in there, a CD. The CD must have extra tracks, and a big book with the history of the sessions and photos and stuff like that. So it's one of those special kind of semi-expensive things that I bought while I was still working. And maybe I should show some of my box sets, just because I can't think of another time when it would come up. Maybe I'll do a video of just not all of them, but just some various box sets that kind of span jazz and maybe even rock. Who knows? I don't know. I know I have a box set of the first Tubular Bells, Mike Oldfield. So, do I pick another vinyl? Yeah, I'm gonna take a chance and pick another vinyl and hope it's not one that I have to talk a lot about. Let's go for the white one. It's white. I went for the white album. Here is, I bought this at Sam Goody. Sam Goody was another chain that was very big, and it wasn't just in this area. $5.99 years ago. The Explorer series, and None Such Explorer. And I bought this at a time I had already been, listening to electronic music, had already been listening to ECM jazz, had already been listening to mainstream jazz, and was expanding my horizons into world music, which didn't have a name yet. It wasn't called world music, called ethnic music. And I bought this, the Kodo Music of Japan. Now, I don't have this exactly on CD, but I do have other compilations of traditional Japanese music featuring the Kodo, because it's a stringed instrument that I particularly like. And this one is, what can you say? You must know something about the Explorer series. Here's a little booklet that was included in there. None Such Explorer series. Look for our forthcoming compact disc digital releases. Wow. So I must have bought this close to the, then that means I must have bought this early in the 80s when compact discs were just starting to hit the market. And mostly what they're showing, I love these, even when they're outdated, showing the catalog, or and mostly, this is classical stuff mostly. I love seeing these old things, and I'm thinking these all look like they're LPs. I'm fairly sure these are all LPs from the time. I also love these old catalogs. like the ones that they included with the ECM albums. I have dozens of those things. Yeah, so what can you say? I pulled out or spoke about some Chinese music and Japanese music. I like the same thing about Japanese music that I like about Chinese music. I like the things for small ensembles. From what I remember about this album, it's mostly just koto, which is a very small stringed instrument. And there's a lot of solo koto music in there, and a couple tracks, different performers, but it's hard to say whether this came about, whether this is a compilation album really, or whether this was put together this way, because the None Such series wasn't so much about a single performer as it was about the music. So a producer might go out and seek out, I want to do an album on Japanese koto music, and record several different performers playing. So it kind of looks like a compilation album, like it was taken from different album sources, but generally they weren't. And for the most part, there's a single, there's only 3 different koto players, but one person plays on 4 of the 6 tracks, and then there's 2 other koto players with a track each. Most of it's solo koto music, just that small stringed plucked instrument, and one of them looks like it's a duet, so there's 2 koto players. One track is for koto and shakuhachi, the Japanese flute, and there's a trio track for koto, the shakuhachi, which is the Japanese flute, and the shamisen, which is another stringed instrument. That's probably the most interesting one. They have 2 different stringed instruments and the shakuhachi. So I remember really, really loving this album. I may have this on CD, but I'm not sure. Or I may have just gone out and bought a whole bunch of different koto music albums. But it doesn't tell you so much when this was recorded, though it tells you about the performers. Now, one of the performers on here was born in 1900. So you can bet that this was, probably recorded in the maybe the early 60s, maybe even before then. They're not very good with listing recording dates on here. But it's beautiful, peaceful, excellent late night music. Which again, now I want to hear it. I got to see if I have the CD of this. I might end up just pulling out some koto music in general. Besides the booklet, not much information. Just that it was recorded in Japan, so it doesn't really tell you the year. I'm surprised, because None Such Explorer is such a carefully documented label that you think that they would include all kinds of biographical information on their releases. Okay, I did 4. I broke a record. I did 4 vinyl pulls this time. Still just barely under a half hour. So I'm going to go now before it spills over the half hour mark. And hope everybody finds some kind of value in this. And I'll be back soon. Take care.
Tune in next time for more Tales from the Garage.